Sometimes a single object can carry an entire family's history, and sometimes it finds its way home when nobody expects it. The grand ballroom of the Whitmore Foundation shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers on a cool spring evening in Manhattan. Hundreds of guests filled the elegant space. Business leaders, philanthropists, politicians, and community advocates moved between round tables draped in white linen. Soft music floated through the air, while servers carried silver trays between conversations worth millions of dollars. At the center of it all sat Margaret Whitmore. At 71 years old, she remained one of the most respected women in the country. Her foundation had funded hospitals, scholarships, and community programs for decades. People admired her success, her generosity, and her resilience. Yet very few knew that beneath her polished public image lived a sorrow she had carried for more than 20 years. Tonight was supposed to be another routine charity gala, another evening dedicated to helping children across the country. Nothing more. Then she saw the necklace. Near the stage, a group of children from various scholarship programs gathered while waiting for their presentation to begin. Among them stood a young black girl wearing a simple blue dress. She looked no older than 10. Unlike many of the other children, she seemed more interested in watching the audience than being seen by it. Her posture was quiet, curious, thoughtful. As she turned her head toward one of the event coordinators, something slipped free from beneath the collar of her dress. A small silver necklace. Margaret's breath caught instantly. The room around her seemed to disappear. Conversations faded. Music vanished. Even the applause from a nearby table became distant. Her eyes locked onto the pendant hanging from the chain. It was a silver locket shaped like a tiny compass. Delicate, elegant, unmistakable. Margaret slowly set down the glass she had been holding. Her hands were trembling. Across the ballroom, the little girl adjusted the necklace without realizing she was being watched. The movement revealed a tiny engraving near the edge of the pendant. Margaret felt her heart begin to race. No, it could not be. The necklace looked identical to one she had not seen in over 2 decades. A necklace that should not have existed anywhere outside a single branch of her family. Memories flooded her mind without warning. A young boy laughing beneath summer sunlight. Tiny hands opening a velvet gift box. A promise made long ago. A promise connected to that very necklace. Margaret blinked several times, convinced her eyes must be deceiving her. Yet when she looked again, the pendant remained exactly where it had been. Real. Impossible. Across the room, the young girl smiled politely as another child spoke to her. There was nothing remarkable about the moment itself. Yet Margaret could not stop staring. Something about the child felt strangely familiar. Not just the necklace. Something deeper. Something she could not explain. For the first time in years, a question she thought had died long ago came rushing back to life. And as the young girl stepped toward the stage lights with the silver compass resting against her chest, Margaret Whitmore found herself rising slowly from her chair, unable to look away. Margaret remained standing long after the children had begun their presentation. Around her, guests applauded politely as scholarship recipients shared stories about their dreams and accomplishments. Yet she heard almost none of it. Her attention remained fixed on the silver compass resting against the young girl's chest. 22 years earlier, that necklace had entered her family's history on a bright summer afternoon at the Whitmore estate in Connecticut. The memory arrived so clearly that it felt less like recollection and more like time itself folding backward. She could still see her grandson, Ethan Whitmore, running through the gardens at 11 years old. He had been energetic, curious, and endlessly adventurous. While other children spent afternoons playing video games, Ethan spent his exploring forests, building maps, and reading books about distant places. On his 11th birthday, Margaret had given him a special gift. A handcrafted silver compass necklace commissioned from a local artisan. Inside the locket was a tiny inscription known only to family members. For simple words, find your way home. Ethan had loved it immediately. He wore it nearly every day, through middle school, through high school, through college. The necklace became part of him. Years later, when Ethan announced he wanted to travel across the country documenting community stories and nonprofit projects, Margaret worried constantly. Yet she understood his restless spirit. Before he left, she remembered touching the silver compass one final time and reminding him of the inscription hidden inside. Ethan had smiled and promised he would always come home. At first he did, Phone calls arrived every week, then every month, then less frequently. Life became complicated. Disagreements emerged within the family. Business expectations collided with personal dreams. Eventually, Ethan chose a path very different from the one others had planned for him. Contact grew distant, then almost non-existent. Nobody knew exactly where he was. Some relatives assumed he simply wanted independence. Others believed he would return eventually. Margaret never stopped hoping. Yet years passed. Birthdays came and went. Holidays arrived and faded. The empty chair at family gatherings became painfully familiar. Through it all, one image remained frozen in her mind. Ethan standing in the driveway with a backpack over one shoulder and the silver compass necklace resting against his chest. That had been the last time she remembered seeing it. The applause inside the ballroom pulled Margaret back to the present. The children's presentation had ended. Guests were standing and chatting as servers circulated through the room. Near the stage, the young girl was helping gather papers alongside several event volunteers. Margaret watched carefully. The more she observed, the stronger the feeling became. It was irrational, impossible, yet she could not ignore it. Something connected this child to a chapter of her life she thought had been permanently closed. A foundation employee approached her table and quietly asked whether she would like assistance returning to the program schedule. Margaret barely heard the question. Instead, she asked one of her own, "Who is that girl?" The employee glanced toward the stage. "Her name is Zoe Carter," he replied. "She received one of the foundation's youth education scholarships this year." Margaret nodded slowly. Zoe Carter. The name meant nothing to her. Yet the necklace meant everything. As she watched the young girl laugh with another student, Margaret felt a question taking root inside her heart. If that necklace truly belonged to Ethan, how had it found its way around the neck of a child who seemed to know nothing about the family that once treasured it? The gala ended hours later, but Margaret carried the image of the silver compass home with her. Long after the final guests departed and the ballroom lights dimmed, she remained awake in the library of her Manhattan townhouse. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows while a fire burned quietly in the marble fireplace. Open folders and foundation reports rested untouched on the desk before her. Instead, her attention remained fixed on a single question. Who was Zoe Carter? The next morning, Margaret did something she had not done in years. She asked her assistant to arrange a private meeting with one of the foundation coordinators responsible for youth scholarship recipients. By afternoon, a file sat on her desk. The information inside seemed ordinary at first. Zoe Carter, 10 years old, excellent student, scholarship recipient, resident of Newark, New Jersey, lived with her mother, Danielle Carter. No father listed in the application records. Margaret read every page carefully, yet none of it explained the necklace. 2 days later, another opportunity presented itself. The foundation was hosting a smaller educational event for scholarship families. Margaret rarely attended these gatherings personally. This time, she insisted. The community center buzzed with activity as children worked on science projects, art displays, and reading programs. Margaret moved quietly through the building, greeting families and volunteers. Then she spotted Zoe sitting alone at a table near the windows. Colored pencils and paper were spread before her as she carefully sketched a city skyline. For a moment, Margaret simply watched. There was something familiar about the girl's concentration. The way she tilted her head while drawing. The slight crease between her eyebrows when she focused. Small details that awakened memories she could not quite explain. Eventually, Margaret approached. Zoe looked up immediately and offered a polite smile. "Hello, ma'am," she said. Margaret smiled warmly. "Hello, Zoe." The girl seemed surprised that she knew her name. Margaret glanced toward the drawing. "That is beautiful." Zoe brightened instantly. "Thank you. I like drawing buildings." Margaret sat beside her. "So did someone I knew a long time ago." Zoe smiled shyly and returned to her sketch. For several minutes they talked about school, favorite books, and future dreams. The conversation felt effortless. Zoe possessed a quiet intelligence that reminded Margaret of someone she had once loved dearly. Then Margaret noticed the necklace resting against the girl's sweater. Up close, the details were unmistakable. The silver compass, the delicate craftsmanship, the tiny engraving near the edge. Her heart began racing again. Carefully, she chose her next question. "That necklace is very special, isn't it?" Zoe's hand instinctively touched the pendant. Her expression softened. It was my mom's. Margaret felt a chill move through her chest. Your mother gave it to you? Zoe nodded. She says it belonged to someone important before that. Margaret's pulse quickened. Do you know who? Zoe shook her head. No. Mom never really talks about it. The answer should have disappointed her. Instead, it deepened the mystery. Margaret studied the child quietly. As sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the silver compass between them, a strange feeling settled over her. It was more than curiosity now, more than coincidence. For the first time, she began to wonder if the necklace had not simply survived the years. Perhaps it had been carrying a story all along. And perhaps that story had finally begun leading her back to the family she thought she had lost forever. Over the next several days, Margaret found herself returning to the memory of her conversation with Zoe more often than she cared to admit. She had spent a lifetime making decisions based on facts, evidence, and careful judgment. Yet this situation felt different. Every instinct told her there was something important hidden beneath the surface. The necklace, the missing family history, the girl's familiar mannerisms. None of it made sense independently. Together, however, they formed a pattern she could no longer ignore. One rainy afternoon, Margaret traveled to Newark under the pretense of visiting one of the Foundation's education initiatives. In reality, she hoped to learn more about Zoe's family. The neighborhood was modest but welcoming. Children rode bicycles along tree-lined streets, while neighbors greeted one another from front porches. It was a world far removed from the luxury of Manhattan penthouses and private boardrooms. Yet Margaret had learned long ago that character could never be measured by a zip code. Through Foundation records, she had obtained contact information for Danielle Carter. Before arriving, she worried the visit might seem intrusive. Instead, when Danielle opened the front door, she appeared surprised but gracious. The woman was in her early 30s, with kind eyes and an expression that suggested both strength and exhaustion. Margaret immediately understood that raising a child alone had not been easy. After exchanging introductions, Danielle invited her inside. The home was simple but filled with warmth. Family photographs lined the shelves. Children's artwork decorated several walls. Near a window sat a small desk covered with books and school projects that clearly belonged to Zoe. The sight made Margaret smile. As they spoke over coffee, the conversation began naturally. They discussed education, scholarship opportunities, and Zoe's future ambitions. Danielle's pride in her daughter was obvious. Every time Zoe's name came up, her face brightened. Eventually, Margaret carefully guided the conversation toward the necklace. The change was immediate. Danielle's smile faded slightly, not out of fear, but hesitation. She looked down at her coffee cup for several seconds before speaking. Zoe told me you asked about it. Margaret nodded gently. I hope I did not make her uncomfortable. You did not, Danielle replied softly. It is just complicated. Margaret waited patiently. Years of leadership had taught her that silence often revealed more than pressure ever could. Finally, Danielle stood and walked toward a small cabinet near the living room bookshelf. After opening a drawer, she removed an old photograph. The edges were worn with age. For a moment, she simply held it in her hands. Then she passed it across the table. Margaret looked down. Her breath caught instantly. The photograph showed a young man standing beside Danielle many years earlier. They appeared happy, relaxed, in love. Margaret felt the room tilt around her. She recognized him immediately. Older than the boy she remembered. Different hairstyle, different clothes, yet unmistakably the same person. Ethan Whitmore, her grandson. For several seconds, she could not speak. Danielle watched her carefully. You know him, she said quietly. Margaret lifted her eyes. Emotion threatened to overwhelm her. Yes, she whispered. Danielle took a slow breath. Then I think you understand why I never knew who to call. Outside, rain continued tapping against the windows. Inside, two women sat across from one another as decades of unanswered questions began moving toward the truth. And resting silently on the coffee table between them lay the first piece of evidence that the impossible might actually be real. Margaret did not leave Danielle's home for nearly 3 hours. As rain continued falling outside, the two women sat across from one another piecing together fragments of a story neither had fully understood until now. The photograph remained on the coffee table between them, no longer just an old picture, but a bridge connecting two worlds that had been separated for years. Danielle explained that she had met Ethan nearly 11 years earlier while volunteering on a community storytelling project in Philadelphia. At the time, she knew very little about his family. Ethan rarely discussed wealth, business, or social status. He preferred talking about people, neighborhoods, and the lives he encountered during his travels. To Danielle, he was simply kind, thoughtful, and curious about the world. Their friendship gradually became something deeper. For a period of time, they built a quiet life together away from public attention. Then circumstances changed. Ethan accepted an opportunity involving documentary work overseas. The assignment was supposed to last only several months. Before leaving, he promised to return. Danielle smiled sadly as she remembered those days. "He carried that silver compass everywhere," she said softly. "He told me it was the most important gift he had ever received." Margaret lowered her eyes. The words felt painfully familiar. Danielle continued. "Before he left, he gave it to me. He said if he ever got lost, it would remind me where he wanted to come back to." Silence settled between them. Margaret listened carefully. There was no bitterness in Danielle's voice, only affection and lingering sadness. Several months after Ethan departed, communication became increasingly difficult. Messages arrived less often. Travel schedules changed. Eventually, contact stopped altogether. Danielle searched for answers, but found very little. Then she discovered she was expecting a child. Zoe, alone and uncertain, she focused on building a future for her daughter. The necklace remained one of the few physical reminders of the man she had loved. As years passed, Danielle occasionally considered contacting the Whitmore family. Yet she hesitated. She knew almost nothing about them beyond Ethan's last name and a handful of stories. The prospect felt overwhelming. "I never wanted anyone to think I was asking for something," she admitted quietly. Margaret felt her heart ache. How many years had been lost because of fear, assumptions, and silence? Looking around the modest living room, she realized Danielle had raised Zoe with remarkable strength. The child was thriving, intelligent, kind, creative. Everything Margaret remembered about Ethan seemed reflected in her. Before leaving, Margaret asked one final question. "Do you still have anything else from Ethan?" Danielle hesitated. Then she walked to a nearby bookshelf and carefully removed a small wooden box. Inside rested several photographs, handwritten notes, and an envelope that appeared untouched. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. Margaret stared at it. Ethan's handwriting covered the front. Danielle explained that the letter had arrived months after communication ended. By then she had been afraid to open it, worried it might contain news she was not ready to face. For years the envelope remained sealed. Neither woman spoke as they looked at it together. The answer to so many questions might be waiting inside. Yet neither felt prepared for what they might discover. As Margaret prepared to leave that evening, she glanced once more toward a framed photograph of Zoe. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider a possibility that no longer seemed impossible. The child who had unknowingly walked into a charity gala wearing a silver compass might not simply be connected to Ethan's story. She might be the missing piece that had been absent from the Whitmore family all along. The sealed envelope remained on Margaret's mind long after she returned to Manhattan. For days she found herself staring out the windows of her office, replaying every conversation she had shared with Danielle. The photograph, the necklace, the years of silence. Each discovery seemed to bring her closer to the truth, while simultaneously revealing how much remained unknown. Finally, 1 week later, Margaret returned to Newark. This time the atmosphere inside Danielle's home felt different. Less uncertain, more hopeful. They sat together at the same kitchen table where so many questions had first been asked. Between them rested the wooden box and the unopened envelope. Sunlight streamed through the curtains while the distant sounds of children playing drifted in from outside. Neither woman spoke for several moments. The significance of the moment felt almost overwhelming. After more than a decade, the final words Ethan had sent were still waiting to be heard. Danielle carefully picked up the envelope. Her hands trembled slightly. Margaret could not blame her. Some letters carried information. Others carried entire lives. With a slow breath, Danielle opened the seal. The paper inside had aged but remained perfectly readable. As she unfolded the letter, silence filled the room. Then she began reading aloud. Ethan's words were warm and familiar. He wrote about the communities he was visiting, the people he was meeting, and the stories he hoped to share through his work. He spoke about purpose, hope, and the belief that every person deserved to be seen. Margaret smiled through tears. The voice she remembered seemed alive again within every sentence. Then the tone of the letter changed. Ethan described plans to return home. He explained that he wanted to reconnect with both Danielle and his family. He admitted that years of distance had created misunderstandings he no longer wished to carry. Most importantly, he revealed something neither woman expected. Attached to the final page was a copy of a photograph. In the image, Ethan stood beside Margaret during his college graduation. On the back, written in his handwriting, was a short note. "One day, I want my future children to know both sides of their family." Danielle stopped reading. Tears filled her eyes. Margaret pressed a hand against her chest. The words felt like a message sent directly across time. As they continued examining the contents of the box, another discovery emerged. Tucked beneath several photographs rested a folded document. It was an old travel journal Ethan had kept during his early years on the road. Inside were dozens of entries describing places, experiences, and people he encountered. Near the middle of the journal, Margaret found something extraordinary. A page dedicated entirely to Danielle. Ethan wrote about her kindness, intelligence, and strength. He described her as the person who made every place feel like home. Margaret quietly passed the journal back. Neither woman needed to say what they were both thinking. Ethan had never intended to disappear from their lives forever. Somewhere along the way, circumstances had intervened. Communication had been lost. Time had passed, yet his intentions had remained clear. As the afternoon sun filled the kitchen with golden light, Margaret looked toward a nearby photograph of Zoe. For the first time, uncertainty began giving way to conviction. The evidence was no longer scattered fragments. It was becoming a complete story. A story leading directly toward a little girl who still had no idea that her life was about to change forever. The weeks that followed brought a quiet transformation. What had begun as curiosity had become certainty in Margaret's heart. The silver compass, the photographs, Ethan's journal, the unopened letter, and the countless details that connected one story to another all pointed toward the same conclusion. Yet Margaret understood that truth carried responsibility. Before anything else, she wanted to build trust. She wanted Zoe and Danielle to know they were not being welcomed because of a family name. They were being welcomed because they already belonged. One Saturday afternoon, Margaret invited them to visit the Whitmore estate in Connecticut. The property stretched across rolling green hills bordered by ancient oak trees and stone pathways. It was the place where generations of the Whitmore family had celebrated holidays, graduations, and milestones. As the car approached the entrance, Zoe pressed her face gently against the window. Her eyes widened with amazement. The estate looked like something from a storybook. Yet what captured her attention most was not the mansion itself. It was the gardens. Endless rows of flowers, walking paths, and fountains spread across the grounds. Margaret smiled as she watched the girl's reaction. Years earlier, Ethan had explored those same paths with identical curiosity. Throughout the afternoon, Margaret showed them the estate. They visited the library, the greenhouse, and the lakeside pavilion where countless family photographs had been taken over the years. Zoe asked questions about everything. Danielle listened quietly, occasionally exchanging thoughtful glances with Margaret. The visit felt surprisingly natural, as if the estate had been waiting for them. Later, while searching through family albums in the library, Zoe stopped suddenly. "That is him," she said. Margaret looked down at the photograph the girl was holding. Ethan smiled back from the page. Young, confident, full of dreams. Zoe stared at the image for several moments. Then she looked up. "He looks like me." The room fell silent. Danielle lowered her eyes. Margaret felt emotion rise inside her chest. Even without explanations, children often notice truths adults struggled to articulate. Zoe continued studying the photograph. The similarities were impossible to ignore. The shape of the eyes, the smile, the expression of quiet determination. Pieces of Ethan seemed reflected across generations. That evening, as the sun began setting beyond the hills, Margaret gathered enough courage to share part of the truth. Sitting together on a terrace overlooking the lake, she spoke gently. She told Zoe about Ethan, about his love of adventure, his kindness, his dreams of helping people. She described the compass necklace and the words engraved inside it. Zoe listened carefully. Then Margaret opened the locket. For the first time, the child saw the inscription hidden within the silver compass. "Find your way home." Zoe read the words twice. Something about them seemed to affect her deeply. For several moments, she remained quiet. Then she asked the question Margaret had been expecting. Was Ethan part of your family? Margaret nodded softly. Yes. Zoe looked down at the necklace resting in her hands. The evening breeze moved gently through the trees surrounding the lake. Somewhere in the distance, birds settled into their nests. And as the last light of day reflected across the water, a truth that had remained hidden for more than a decade stood on the edge of finally being spoken aloud. The following month, the Whitmore Foundation hosted its annual community celebration in New York. Unlike the formal gala where everything had begun, this event focused on families, students, and scholarship recipients. Children displayed artwork, science projects, and community service initiatives while parents and volunteers filled the grand hall with conversation and laughter. Margaret had attended every celebration for years, but none had ever felt as important as this one. Zoe and Danielle arrived shortly before the program began. Volunteers greeted them warmly while scholarship students hurried between exhibits. Zoe carried a portfolio of drawings she hoped to display. As she moved through the room, she seemed completely unaware that many eyes quietly followed her. Not because she was a scholarship recipient, because Margaret had spent weeks introducing her to family friends, foundation board members, and longtime associates who had become curious about the remarkable child now appearing so frequently beside her. Throughout the afternoon, Zoe shared her artwork with visitors. Several pieces featured city skylines. Others showed gardens, rivers, and family scenes. One drawing attracted particular attention. It showed a young traveler holding a compass beneath a sky filled with stars. Standing beside him was a little girl following the same path years later. Margaret stared at the drawing longer than anyone else. The meaning was unmistakable. Even without knowing the entire story, Zoe somehow seemed to understand it. As the evening program began, families gathered around the stage. Margaret sat beside Danielle in the front row. For a brief moment, neither woman spoke. They no longer felt like strangers connected by coincidence. They felt connected by something far deeper. The event director stepped to the microphone and welcomed the audience. Several awards were presented. Scholarship recipients were recognized. Then Margaret unexpectedly rose from her seat. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Although she often gave closing remarks, she rarely interrupted the scheduled program. The hall gradually fell silent. Margaret walked slowly onto the stage. For several seconds, she simply looked out at the crowd. Then her eyes found Zoe. Emotion filled her voice as she began speaking. She talked about family, about lost connections, about how life sometimes carried people in different directions before leading them back together. Most guests assumed she was sharing a personal reflection. Only a few understood the deeper meaning. Then Margaret turned toward Zoe and gently invited her onto the stage. The young girl looked confused but obeyed. Hundreds of people watched as she stepped forward. Margaret knelt slightly so their eyes met. Tears shimmered in her eyes. For years she had imagined what it might feel like to find a missing piece of her family. Nothing had prepared her for the reality. "Zoe," she said softly, her voice trembling. "There is something I should have told you a long time ago." The room became completely silent. Danielle stood nearby, quietly encouraging her daughter with a nod. Margaret reached into her pocket and removed a photograph of Ethan. She showed it to Zoe. "This was my grandson." Zoe immediately recognized the image. Then Margaret gently touched the silver compass resting against the girl's chest. "And I believe he was your grandfather." For several seconds, time seemed to stop. Zoe looked from the photograph to the necklace and back again. Understanding slowly appeared across her face. Tears filled Margaret's eyes. Unable to hold back any longer, she wrapped her arms around the child. Zoe embraced her in return. Around them, hundreds of people watched in silence. Some smiled. Others wiped away tears. Yet for Margaret, only one thing mattered. After years of searching for what had been lost, she was finally holding family in her arms once again. The months that followed brought a kind of healing none of them had expected. What began with a silver compass at a charity gala gradually grew into something far more meaningful. Margaret, Danielle, and Zoe no longer met only at foundation events or special occasions. They became part of one another's daily lives. Weekends were often spent together at the Whitmore estate, where Zoe explored gardens Ethan had once wandered as a boy. She sat for hours in the library reading books he had loved and studied family albums that filled entire shelves. With every visit, pieces of the past became part of her present. Yet the greatest gift was not the estate, the history, or the family legacy. It was belonging. For years, Margaret had carried the quiet ache of an unfinished chapter. She had mourned a grandson she loved deeply and regretted the distance that had separated their lives. Now, through Zoe, she felt connected to him again. Not because the child replaced what had been lost, but because she carried forward the kindness, curiosity, and hope that had always defined him. Danielle experienced her own healing. For more than a decade, she had carried responsibility alone. Every decision, every challenge, every milestone had rested on her shoulders. Now she discovered she no longer had to navigate everything by herself. Margaret never tried to take her place as Zoe's mother. Instead, she became something equally valuable. Family. The kind that offered support without conditions and love without expectations. As for Zoe, her world expanded in ways she never imagined. She continued excelling in school and pursuing her passion for art. Inspired by Ethan's journals and stories, she began creating a series of drawings about journeys, family, and finding one's place in the world. Several pieces were eventually displayed through foundation programs across the state. Visitors often stopped to admire the recurring symbol appearing throughout her work. A small silver compass. One autumn afternoon, nearly a year after the gala where everything began, the Whitmore Foundation unveiled a new scholarship initiative dedicated to young artists from underserved communities. Hundreds gathered for the celebration. Families, students, teachers, and community leaders filled the event hall. At the center of the stage stood Zoe. Beside her stood Danielle and Margaret. Together they unveiled the program's name, the Compass Scholarship. The audience applauded warmly. Yet Margaret's attention remained fixed on the child standing beside her. The same child who had unknowingly carried a family story around her neck for years. Later that evening, after the crowds had dispersed, the three of them walked through the foundation gardens beneath a sky painted gold by the setting sun. Zoe laughed as she shared plans for future artwork. Danielle listened proudly. Margaret smiled quietly. For the first time in many years, she felt peace. Before leaving, Zoe slipped her hand into Margaret's and looked up. "I think the compass worked," she said. Margaret blinked back tears. "What do you mean?" Zoe touched the necklace resting against her chest. It helped everyone find their way home. For a moment, nobody spoke. The words carried a truth larger than any of them could fully express. As the evening light settled across the gardens, 3 generations stood together, surrounded not by wealth or status, but by something far more valuable. Connection, forgiveness, family, and above the silver compass, hidden exactly where it had always been, for simple words continued guiding them forward. Find your way home.